So sometimes you want to keep doing something until it executes correctly. So sometimes we know this is the way my code should work if all goes according to plan. But if something doesn't go according to plan, I want to try again. I want to keep looping until I get things to run the way I want them to run, until I get good input. So to do this, you basically use a combination of exception handling and loops. And if you want to keep looping until you get the code to run without an exception, you put the exception handling code inside the loop. So the loop's on the outside and inside is the exception handling code. So for example, if you have some condition, you want to loop until that condition is met. And then here you put in the try. So you put in the try. This is the code that you expect to go well. If you get all the way through here, then hey, you succeeded. So you can set your Boolean flag to true. But if something went wrong, and you jump down to the catch block, presumably, give some sort of message about what happened and what to do different, then success is still false. So you'll loop back up and come back in, and you'll just keep looping until you make it all the way through the try block. So let's take a look at how we could do that in our positive number program. So I'm actually just going to make a separate method so that we can kind of separate things out, and I'll call this looping read input, and it's going to start the same way. So we're going to ask the user to enter in a positive number. I'm going to go back to using my parse int, and then I'm just going to have my same logic here. Only I'm going to change this to, hey, that's not a number. Try again. Okay, so that's my same code that we had before, right? Is we've got our try, we try to read it in. If we were able to read it in, we print out whether it's positive or not. If an exception happens, we catch it. But now we want to keep reading until we get the input that we want. So to do that, I'm going to surround this whole try catch inside of a loop. So I'm going to say while, and now I need some condition. So I'm going to declare a condition, valid input. And at first it's false. I don't have any valid input yet. So as long as I don't have valid input, I'm going to keep looping. Now, right now, this is an infinite loop because valid input is never reset. Where should I reset valid input? Well, I basically need to set it somewhere after this parse int line because that's the line that might generate the exception. So I could put it right afterwards, or I could put it down here. Either one. Basically, we're saying is that, hey, if you make it to this part of the try, you're done. You did everything you need to do. You don't need to loop again. But if something happens up here that throws an exception and you jump to the catch, then valid input's still going to be false. So you'll loop around again. So now let's call that method instead. And now if we type in hello, it says that's not a number, try again. Type in, Jessica, hey, that's not a number, try again. Type in 10 and we're done. Okay, so this is a common thing to do, to put exception handling inside of a loop so that you can continue executing until you get the result that you want. So we're going to do another example. We're going to write some code that uses exception handling, and what we're trying to have the code do is read in five-digit zip codes from the user. So we want the user to enter in 5 zip codes, each of them containing 5 digits. And we're going to use exception handling to account for our bad input, and we're also going to count the number of valid and invalid inputs. We basically want to know how many times did it take for the user to get this right. So I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to pause this so you don't have to wait for my Eclipse to catch up with us. Okay, so I've got my class set up, zip code processor, and I've just got a main method. So I'm going to ask the user to read in 5 zip codes, and I am going to store them as numbers. Okay, so you could think about storing them as strings, you could think about storing them as numbers. I'm going to choose to store them as numbers. So I'm actually going to create an integer array, and I'll just call it zip codes, and it's going to hold 5 integers because that's what I said I wanted to read in 5 zip codes. And I also want to keep track of a valid and invalid count. So I want to say, valid codes equals 0 and invalid codes equals 0. Okay, so what I want to do is I now want to ask the user to enter in these 5 zip codes, but I want to make sure that they're entering in numbers, 5 numbers, right? So oftentimes when you're writing code that's going to use exception handling, it can be helpful to kind of think about the best case first, right? Think about kind of writing your code as if nothing's going to go wrong, and then sort of think about, okay, where could things go wrong, and how can I add in my try-catch exception handling to deal with that? So I'm going to start by, again, assuming everything's going to go right, okay? So I am going to say while my valid codes is less than zip codes.length, right? Because I need to eventually have that many. I'm going to create a scanner. Tell the user to enter a 5-digit zip code. Okay. Import my scanner. Oops. Okay, and now there's 2 things I need to think about. The first thing is I need to think about whether what I'm reading in is 5 digits long. And then I also need to make sure that not only, or I should say 5 characters long, and then I also need to make sure that each one of those characters is a digit. Now, there are things I could do. I could use a method from the character class is digit. I could do that. But because we are practicing exception handling, I'm going to use exception handling. So we're going to read it in first as a string. So I'm going to say zip code string equals scan dot next line. So I'm going to read it in as a string. And now I'm first just going to use a conditional to check to see if it's the appropriate length. So I'm going to say, okay, well, if zip code string dot length is 5, we're good to go so far. Otherwise, invalid length, and then I'm going to loop back around. I also here want to increment my invalid codes because they entered in an invalid code. Okay, so for my zip code length equals 5, let's assume right now that they all goes well, right? They entered in 5 digits just like they're supposed to. So I am now going to say, well, zip codes at valid zip codes gets integer dot parse int zip code string. Okay. And, sorry. There we go. And I will, of course, increment valid codes. Okay. So let's take a look at running this program. All goes well. So, enter the 5-digit zip code. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I enter in a 4-digit, it says, oh, invalid length, asks it again, and then we're all done. And at the end here, we'll print things out. So we'll say you entered valid codes. And then we'll actually just print them out using arrays.toString for my zip codes. And of course I have to import that. Okay, so let's try that again. And we'll do a couple valid ones. We'll do a couple invalid ones. And there we go. We entered 5 valid, 3 invalid, and there are the valid codes. Okay, so all went well. All went according to plan. Now, what happens if all doesn't go according to plan? And I enter hello. Well, then again, I get a crash. Okay, so there are 2 things that could go wrong here, right? The user could enter a string that's too short, or they can enter a string that doesn't have digits. Now, you could think about using exception handling for the string being too short, and we can think about that in a moment. But let's start with just dealing with the digit. So essentially what we want to do is we want to say, okay, well, this is where that exception could be generated, right? But perhaps I want to put my whole kind of group of code that represents this action of reading in a digit, of reading in the code rather, and evaluating it and putting it in the array. Perhaps I want to put all of that in my try block. So again, what to put in a try block and what not to put in a try block it's subjective. Not two people are not going to necessarily choose the same bit of code, and one of them isn't right, one of them isn't wrong. You just have to kind of logically have a reason for why you did what you did. So I'm going to choose to put all of this code inside the try block because this is what represents everything going right, right? If everything goes right, I can, this is everything that I want to happen. I want to tell them to read it, to enter a code. They're going to enter a good code. It's going to be the right length. I'm going to add it to the array and increment my counter and loop back around. So this is everything that could go right. Okay. So now what could go wrong, that happens here. So you could think, well, maybe I'll just put the try catch just around that particular part. And that might work, but I think in general it's a good practice to try to kind of group together code that accomplishes one task, right, that's related to each other. And it's okay to have some of the code inside your try block, not throw an exception, right? Like this print line is not going to throw an exception, but I put it inside my try block because to me it's part of that algorithm. It's part of that part of the task. So what I'm going to do down here in my number format, if I catch that number format exception in my catch block, I'm going to say zip codes must only contain digits. Okay. And then I'm going to increment my invalid codes. Okay. And we'll loop back around. So now let's run this again, and we'll put in one code that's too short. We'll put in one code that's text, and we see that, oh, well, first of all, it's too long. So I have to put in text that is 5. And now it says this zip code must only contain digits. So then I'll go ahead and enter in the rest of the good ones. And now we say we again had 5 valid, 3 invalid, and there they are. So this is an example of, again, putting that exception handling inside of a loop so that if something goes wrong, I can continue on and I can keep reading in or doing whatever it is I need to do until it runs properly with no exceptions.